It's time for the chip race.
For strategy this week, we are joined by one of the greats of our game. He recently won his first WSOP bracelet in this year's $1,500 Millionaire Maker on GG Poker for $1.5 million. Welcome back to the show, Daniel Dvoress.
Thank you for having me back.
So great to have you, Daniel. To the hand, it comes from the 250k Triton event. 42 players entered this, and at the time of this hand, there are 22 left. The blinds are 3k, 6k with a 6k big blind ante. Daniel, you are under the gun 7 max with 205k, and our villain in this case will be David Peters, who is in the big blind with 244k. You look down at the ace of spades, king of clubs, and you open it to 13k. David Peters defends his big blind with the 8 of spades, 7 of clubs. Nothing really remarkable there, so I think we probably all benefit from moving straight into the much more interesting later streets. To the flop, there is 35k in the pot, and it comes the jack of spades, 6 of clubs, 5 of spades. He checks, and with lots of backdoor nut potential and 2 overs, you bet 15k. As Lex says on commentary, you have a lot of turns that you can barrel, so it's a good C bet. But you chose a 43% sizing, and I'm interested as to why you chose that amount.
So on a board like that, I'll be using a variety of sizes. Some hands benefit from having a really small size. Some hands that are more vulnerable but clear value bets tend to benefit from a slightly bigger size. And Ace King is really a hand that belongs to kind of neither of those categories. The kind of middling sizing, I chose it because it's a hand that preserves equity very well, even when I do use a size like that. And I need to have some bluffs and some air in my range when I use the big size. Otherwise, I can't value bet for a big size. So it's more of like a balancing thing and a hand that makes sense to use as a big size because it retains equity well, even versus a slightly tighter continue range.
Very good. Well, Dara, these days I'm far more used to seeing smaller C bets on these types of boards. What's the general principle in bet sizing in what I assume is a fairly high C bet spot here for Daniel?
Yeah, I think Daniel touched on it there, the reasons why we bet different sizes. I actually watched a really good video Daniel made recently for Run It Once where he talked about how in a lot of spots regs overuse smaller sizings and they miss bigger bet sizings on certain types of boards where they have a clear range advantage, like Ace King 4, for example. So when I was looking at this in the solver, I was interested to put in a couple of different sizings and see what would come out. The solver pretty much always wants to see bet here because we have a fairly clear range advantage on this board, 57-43 roughly. I gave it min bet sizing, the sizing that Daniel used, and then an 80% of pot. And the solver used all 3 sizings with most of the hands in its range. With Ace King off specifically, it tended to favour the smaller sizing when it had the Ace of Spades. But when it only had the King of Spades or no spade, it used a bigger sizing. And I think that's kind of consistent with what we're trying to achieve with the bet. And when we have the Ace of Spades, as Lex said on commentary, we have a lot of good turn cards.
Well, facing this bet, David Peters actually decides to raise, but I think a lot of players in this spot would actually call. Many of you out there might be thinking that's what you would do. He's one of the toughest players around, and he does decide to go to 42k. Dara, why is it good to take the initiative here in his spot? I think a lot of people would be fearing a shove for Daniel and then would end up sort of facing that really wonky spot of potentially being blown off their equity / almost facing a situation where they can call at roughly the right price.
Yeah, well, I think the thing is here, given how wide Daniel is going to be c-betting, we have hands in our range that we want to check raise for value. And then we have to balance those with other types of hands as well, so that not all of our check raises are just value hands. I don't think we can get away with necessarily raising this hand all the time, but it works as an occasional raise. And the fact that we have a spade makes it a better raise. I think more turn cards improve us, give us more equity. I think you're right. I think a lot of players just fall into playing the check call game with this type of hand. But if you are going to have a check raising range, you want to have different types of hands in the range so that if our check raise gets called, we're protected on different runouts.
Well, that's interesting. Well, Daniel, facing this bet, you make the call. We pointed at all those lovely backdoors to go with your overcards versus a tight opponent. I'm guessing this would be a bad call, but versus a balanced villain who will possibly have straight draws, flush draws, and even some low equity backdoors, it's a must-be sticky sort of spot. Can you break down the type of range you think Peters has here and what your plan is on different runouts?
So I think he's going to be raising the obvious value hands. He's going to have some two pairs, some good Jack X. And then I think what he's going to be doing is using lowish frequencies with a variety of bluffs. So occasionally he'll check raise flush draws. Occasionally he'll check raise gut shots. Occasionally he'll check raise open enders. And I think also he'll sneak in some check raises with hands that can't call but have good backdoor potential in being wrapped around the jack. So perhaps something like Queen 10 or King 10 with either a spade blocker or Queen 10 suited with a backdoor flush draw. As for my decision to call versus an opponent like him, of course, I'm looking at my backdoors and that my hand can improve, but I'm also thinking of how often I have to defend versus this check raise, because I know that he can bluff a very wide range and he's risking 42K to win 50K. So I have to defend quite a bit of my range. And looking at where Ace King falls in that, I think that it actually performs better than some made hands that I have in my range. Like I would prefer continuing a hand like Ace King rather than, let's say, pocket eights or pocket sevens. So I'm thinking of my minimum defense frequency when I'm responding to the check raise.
It's really interesting. Just to follow up to both of you in a way, you both alluded to the fact that Peters can have a lot of different hands in this spot. And obviously that's a mixed strategy he's deploying there, where there are lots of different types of hands in there, maybe 10% of the time or 20% of the time or whatever frequency he chooses, which essentially makes him so difficult to play against. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely super annoying to play against someone that you know that they're using mixed strategies, but you're trying to guess the frequencies. More predictable players, like they'll always check call a hand like he has because they're afraid of getting blown off of their equity. And then their check raises will just be super polar. So they'll have the obvious value hands and then they'll check raise a gut shot that they can't continue with, for example. And against players like that, I just have a super easy time on turns and rivers because I know which cards will complete their most likely draws. I know which cards they'll make a pair on, but still have like a weak hand that I lose to that I need to bluff against. And I know which cards that they whiffed on. But when I'm facing a range where, you know, he's got some like Queen 10s in there, some King 10s, some open enders, some gut shots, maybe some flush draws, it's super hard to continue on many runouts, but I just still have to continue my hand on the flop just to not be exploited.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to notice that on commentary, Lex seemed quite surprised by the call. I think this is a spot where people do overfold a lot because they just think, well, I just have ace high and he's check raised me, and my hand, while relatively strong before the check raise, isn't great now, and it's very easy to end up overfolding. It kind of surprised me that Lex was surprised by the call because facing the check raise, Daniel's response with his range is to raise 13%, call 51 and fold 36. Having the spade is the key here. With the spade in our hand, the solver just makes a pure call with ace king, and with that one it throws in a few more raises but basically no folds.
Very cool. Well, to the turn, it comes the 5 of diamonds. The pot is 119k and the board reads Jack of spades, 6 of clubs, 5 of spades, 5 of diamonds. You have 150k behind, and after some thought, Peters checks. You check back. Dara, I know you have a good observation about this street and what a lot of players would do in Peters' seat.
Yeah, I think this is probably a street where people, if they have check raised the previous street, they tend to overbarrel, particularly with the type of hand that he has, and then they end up over bluffing. But obviously, D. Peters is way more balanced, and I was interested to see what the solver would do, at least with the ranges as I assume them. And the equity advantage is still in Daniel's favour here, even after the flop action of the check raise. It's not quite as clear as it was when the flop came down, but it's still roughly 55-45. So therefore, Peters can't get away with just auto betting, and the solver advocates splitting the overall range roughly 50-50. Similarly, because the ranges are quite close together, when Peters does check, the solver also advocates Daniel splitting his range roughly 50-50. Now, with his specific hand of ace king off, it checks that behind most of the time at a far higher frequency. But yeah, it's an interesting street. I think a lot of players will look at this turn and just go, well, that's kind of a brick, so therefore the aggressor from the previous street should keep barreling, and they end up being very unbalanced then in those spots.
Yeah, so I actually tanked quite a bit on the turn because I was thinking if I should be betting my hand ever or if I should always be checking. And also I was thinking about how I would want to play my overpairs on the turn. It's a little bit of a tricky spot where SPR is roughly 1. So if I have an overpair that doesn't need protection, like especially if I have a spade in my hand, I would favor checking back. Something like kings or aces, where I can't really get drawn out on, or at least very often, and it just protects my check back range. So I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking, do I want to bet my hand for protection? And I kind of concluded that with a spade in my hand, I actually don't want to bet because I have like a decent bluff catcher potentially on some rivers. I can also bluff myself on some rivers, and getting check raised would really be awful.
Very good. Well, to the river, it comes to 3 of spades, completing the flop flush draw. The pot is still 119k, and the board reads Jack of spades, 6 of clubs, 5 of spades, 5 of diamonds, 3 of spades. Peters uses every second he can without using a time bank chip before shoving effectively 150k into 119k. 125% of pot. This puts you in a fascinating spot, Daniel. Here's my logic on it, and maybe both of you can tell me how wrong or hopefully how right I am. From Peter's perspective, you look like you've got overpairs a lot, maybe ace jack, king jack suited, queen jack suited as well. The hand you have is plausible too, but it's obviously less obvious. So to properly target those hands on the river, he shouldn't really be too greedy. That said, if you are captain, he knows you know you're captain, he knows you know he knows, then maybe he can go big with all his value and hope to get a sort of suspicious call from you in this leveling war. All that said, versus this sizing, all your hands are kind of the same versus the range. So blockers become the most important factor, and you've got a really good one. The ace of spades removes a lot of the hands he's representing, which consequently changes the balance of value to bluffs. You spend a lot of time banks on this decision before making the call. Am I in the vicinity of what was going through your head?
Yeah, for sure. So some hands I obviously can't fold. Like if I just have aces with a spade, I'm never folding that. If I have kings with a spade, I'm never folding that because I might occasionally beat greedy value. I do think that sizing would be a little bit too greedy, like you said, but there's certain bluff catchers that seem like bluff catchers that are just so strong and so high up in my range that I would never fold. And then aside from that, yeah, when I'm faced with this bet, I'm just like, okay, well, I have a bluff catcher and it's beating all of his bluffs. It's really not that different from having a hand like Queen Jack of Hearts or something like that.
Well, Dara, I alluded to the particular sizing of Peters here. What does the solver do in that spot? Does it like a smaller sizing? Does it like a medium sizing? Does it like bluffing at all?
This was a street that I was the most interested in, partly because when I saw this hand, I had kind of flashbacks to a hand I played against D. Peters in Vegas in the area 10K, where very similar line, and I made a tortured fold on the river. Like, the river really doesn't favor him, so it's an unorthodox sizing, I think, given that the river is not a particularly good river for his range. And actually, the solver, while it does do some betting, it never uses the overbet. Again, I gave it a couple of different sizings, and the size that it wanted to bet, if it was going to bet, was the more normal 2/3 pot. And then looking specifically at his hand, with 8-7 off, without a spade, it just checks and gives up. But with a spade, it does bluff at 35% of the time.
And what does the solver do in Daniel's shoes?
Without the ace of spades, it just pure folds. With the ace of spades, it calls most of the time. The hand I mentioned that I played against him, which was very similar, I don't remember the exact details, but it was a very similar line where he check raised flop, turn went check, check, and then he overbet river, and I made a tortured fold. The interesting thing for me was when I spoke to different people about the hand afterwards, everybody kind of focused on D. Peters and his tendencies. And the reaction was polarized between, oh, it's D. Peters, he bluffs a lot, you have to call. And then the other half of people were, well, after you call his check raise on the flop, I don't think he's going to bluff at that sizing on the river. So it's interesting that like people can look at literally the same player and have two very different impressions. Given that the solver is mixing, that basically means that if he's playing an equilibrium strategy, we have a break-even call. So we call sometimes, fold sometimes. In those spots, it does make sense to kind of look at the player tendencies and ask yourself, well, which is more likely, that he's over bluffing or under bluffing using this line?
I do think that one of the things that happens when he overbets is on the surface, it looks like we're in a tougher spot, right? Because we're faced with a bigger bet. It's actually our tournament life, etc. But I actually was thinking that it makes my spot a little bit easier because it makes whatever he's doing, for sure, the bigger bet size makes his range more polarized. Whether he's doing an exploitative thing and just thinking maybe I'll overcall or overfold, depending on what his tendencies are. I actually think he's fairly balanced. But whatever he's up to, I know that his range is more polar. I know that he can't possibly have queen jack for value for this size that he decided to check raise the flop with, which I guess he would do sometimes, or maybe like a jack with a higher kicker would check raise the flop sometimes. I know that he's not going for value with that. So that allows me to rank my bluff catchers in a little bit easier of a way. Like now I know that when his range is super polar, the ace of spades is just super good. And I don't need a jack in my hand, for example, to call, because blocking the jack doesn't really matter, because he can't have something as light for value. Because whatever he's up to, he's going to be aware that I can still check back strong hands on the turn. I can also check back flush draws on the turn. And for sure, his range is more polar on the river.
That's really interesting. Yeah, no, I love how you put that together. Well, look, it was a spectacular call in a 250k super high roller, and I'm keen not to lose sight of that fact. You were such a cool cucumber afterwards, but is that just one of those things where, well, yeah, it is, it's just a day in the office for you, or are you sort of fist pumping inside?
Like whether I'm right or wrong, I'm always thinking, did I make the right decision? Like that's kind of what's going through my head. And to this day, I actually don't know if I, in essence made the right decision. I happened to be right that time. It's really tricky with guys like D. Peters to know which side of the coin they're on. Like we were talking about his tendencies earlier and how, half the people think he overbluffs and then half the people would think that he doesn't bluff in a certain spot. And it's really tricky because if you only play live, you never really get enough of a sample, because really how many rivers have you played against a particular opponent where they have a polarized range and they either had a pure bluff or a bluff catcher? Like you just don't see that many showdowns. And it's really easy to fall into the trap of, oh yeah, the last two showdowns that I saw, D. Peters was bluffing. It's like, well, yeah, but if he's supposed to be bluffing like half the time in some river spot or a third of the time in some river spot, that's just going to happen a lot and doesn't actually give us any relevant information to what his strategy is. So after a call like that, I'm happy I was right, obviously, but I'm always kind of reevaluating my thought process and trying to compare it to if it would have been right long term.
Well, that's the mark of a true pro. It has been absolutely fantastic having you back on the show. I have no doubt our audience has got an awful lot from this piece. Dara O'Kearney and, of course, Daniel Dvoress, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.